He kicked me out of the waiting room, I say, and my voice catches before I can lay the rest on the table. It is small, ordinary words for something that felt enormous in the moment. He didn't shout. He didn't throw me across the room. He walked up to the receptionist, gave a curt word, and the nurse, who had been kind to me for years, looked at me with the same polite pity they show an elderly stranger who'd lost her way. 1 second, I was sitting on a vinyl chair under a poster about flu shots. The next, I was standing on the sidewalk, watching their car drive away with my son in it, and the waiting room turned into a scene I'd never be able to unsee. The TV over the reception desk had been on, the hospital's loop of community announcements and weather. Instead of the usual rotor of ads, a live stream had cut in, a shaky vertical video with a caption in big, clumsy letters, "Live now." For a second, it looked like a wedding toast. Then I recognized Max's laugh, and the woman with the laugh too. She was leaning forward, hair tucked behind one ear, and she was saying something into the camera and smiling like she was letting an audience in on a secret only she and the person behind the lens should know. It wasn't clinic footage. It was a stream from a restaurant, a house, somewhere they'd been when I'd been paying late bills and sending money to cover rent. Lena waved at the camera, my daughter-in-law, the woman I tried to make room for in my life, and whispered, "Only special people." The words landed like a stone in my chest. They showed a table with champagne, a white dress draped over the back of a chair, and a picture popped up, Max and Lena smiling into a different camera, sealing whatever thing they had done the night before. The caption beneath the stream read, "We did a thing, #JustUs." I remember the dress in my closet as if it were a photograph that came to life. I had bought that fabric without thinking, thrifty and proud, because a new dress on a granddaughter or a future daughter-in-law was one of those small investments that felt like love. The dress had hung on a hanger for months, tags tucked inside, waiting for the day I might be asked. Instead, they had slipped off and made it a backdrop for a celebration that hadn't included me. Only special people. They were special in ways I never was, I thought. My stomach tightened with a sharp old pain I had carried through widowhood, through late-night phone calls and the kind of loneliness that keeps you up tracking names you can count on your fingers. When Max came back into the waiting room, his face was tight like paper. He took one look at the TV, at me, then turned his back and spoke to the nurse in a low voice. Later, I heard she told him I was making a scene. I had only stood up. I had not raised my voice. But once the hospital staff's gaze lands on you as a problem, they see what they are told to see. He said, quietly, and with a firmness I recognized from childhood, when you knew you'd done something wrong and the parent told you to leave, that I should step outside. He said, "This isn't the time." He put a hand on the small of my back, and I felt every year of caregiving, of bank transfers and dinner plates, compress into a single humiliating shove that didn't have to be violent to be cruel. Outside, the air was sharper than I expected for June. Cars moved by with the indifferent rhythm of the city. People on the sidewalk looked in my direction and then away. My phone vibrated in my purse. Lena texting, a laughing emoji, a photo I had tried not to see. They had not waited to call me. They had walked past me without a backward glance, as if they had never known me except as a convenience. That was the day something woke up inside me. I have given away money quietly for years. It starts like small kindnesses, a grocery run, a copay covered, a leak fixed in a basement that only someone irresponsible would ignore. It feels like love when you are younger, and later it is habit. For me, the habit had become a ledger of favors that lived in the margins of my life. I kept paper receipts folded into a shoebox. I kept screenshots of transfer confirmations in a folder on my phone. I kept a quiet accounting in my head of who I had helped and why. The night after the hospital, I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp on low, the apartment's radiator ticking, and I opened the shoebox. There were envelopes labeled in my own looping script. Max rent, Aug 2019. Lena, dress deposit, utilities. Tucked in the lid was a note Max had written for my birthday 5 years ago, when he was drunk with good news about a job, and wrote that he couldn't ask for more because he had me. I had believed him. I had chosen to believe him for the same reason my mother taught me to feed the neighbor's child and to fix a friend's sweater. Love is duty, love is proof you belong. I began to add in my head, aloud into the kitchen air, so that the numbers felt less like guilt and more like evidence. There was rent again, emergency car repairs, a loan I had thought was temporary, a just until, each a line on a spreadsheet I could have made but never did, because I didn't want to see the scale of my own enabling. I made the spreadsheet that night, fingers fumbling on the old laptop like someone starting a ledger after a lifetime of keeping things in jars. When I came to the end, the total stopped me. $33,400. My hands shook as if I were holding a kettle. $33,400. I had written checks and sent wires. Mr. Klein at the bank sometimes knew me by name.
I had paid for phone plans and car insurance, and that white dress that had been a photograph beneath a champagne toast. $33,400 spread across 3 years, a sum I had named quietly, like a prayer.
I traced each line with a finger. There were transfer confirmations, cash withdrawals, a few folded bills I had handed Max across a kitchen counter, with a kind of cadenced reassurance that said, "This will tide you over." The receipts were not proof of love. They were proof of a pattern. I did what seemed to me the only reasonable thing. I called Mr. Klein. He knew my voice without me having to give my account number. "Renati," he said, and there was a warmth in his tone I had never expected from a bank manager. He had helped me set up direct debits with a steady patience, had called me once to remind me about a missed deposit, and had, in the end, handled my small affairs with a care that resembled friendship. I told him what had happened at the hospital. I told him the live stream had shown me faces I knew and a life I had been paying for without being invited into. I told him the number. Mr. Klein paused on the line. "We can stop the automatic transfers if you'd like," he said, and then added, as if to cover his own lack of training in such things, "We'll advise you on the formal steps as best we can." I remember sitting on the floor of my kitchen while he explained in patient sentences how to cancel a recurring transfer, how to change passwords, the small bureaucratic dance of reclaiming access to money you had once given away. His words were not a strategy. They were plumbing. They were the kind of practicalities that make up the bones of everyday survival. I wrote them down, and I felt steadier for having done it. The first few days after I closed the tap on the money were the strangest quiet. My phone stopped lighting up with thanks and with late-night pleas. There were messages, of course, short and pragmatic at first, a question about a dishwasher, a text about a neighbor with a job lead. Then the questions became sharper. "Where are you? Why did you stop?" Max texted once. "Come home, we need to talk." Lena typed, "You always act like this when you don't like our choices." Their language assumed a permanence of my availability, as if money were the only form of language I had left to speak. They did not understand that stopping the transfers was not punishment. It was an experiment in memory, to see what I was to them when my pocketbook was no longer open. A week later, when they came to the apartment without warning, the experiment turned into confrontation. I had been at the sink rinsing a coffee cup when I heard the knock. There are knocks that are ordinary and those that carry the weight of an argument. Max's knock had the second kind, confident with that old sense of ownership that comes from being called mine for decades. I opened the door to find Lena standing a step behind him, a paper bag in her arms. They said hello like strangers greeting someone they'd only met in passing. They stepped into my living room without asking. The walls of my apartment are thin and full of small things that tell the story of a life. A painting by a church friend, a vase from my sister Diana, a shelf of well-thumbed cookbooks. Lena let the paper bag fall on the coffee table. Out of it came a stack of glossy invitations, one of them with a photo of Max looking handsome in a suit someone else had chosen for him. I thought for an instant they would offer these to me, an invitation turned apologetic. Instead, Lena smoothed the edges and said, "We thought you should know." She said it like a courtesy. "You weren't invited," Max said, plain as weather. It was the same phrase as in the live stream, but now spoken into the room with my face in it. I asked them to sit. I told them I needed to understand, and I asked, simply, why? Max looked away, and Lena answered for him in a voice like glass. "We worked things out," she said. "We kept it small." She smiled then, very practiced, and said, "We only invited special people." And there it was again, the phrase like a thud, like a bell. Only special people. I reached for the shoebox and for the receipts, the way someone reaches for a proof of identity. The conversation collapsed into a rehearsal of excuses. It was sudden. We couldn't bring everyone. You would have made a scene. Max said, "You know how it is with family." He said it gently, meaning it like an apology. I told them I had paid the room deposit, the dress, and more. I recited dates like a catechism. July 10th, $2,400 for rent. September 5, $1,200 for car repair. December, $4,000 loan, paid in installments. I watched their faces like someone watching a train wreck and feeling the pressure of air around it. At some point, Max produced an envelope and laid it on the coffee table. "We brought this," he said. Inside were pages clipped together, a document printed in a tidy font, stamped and notarized, something to do with their living arrangement, a letter that talked about our family, about concerns. He had the lawyer with him in the form of paper. I didn't understand then how quickly paper becomes a weapon. Lena bent over toward me, voice low. "You need help, Mom." The pet name had always been soft when he used it on the phone. In her mouth, it felt like an accusation. I stood and went to the kitchen drawer.
I felt inside my coat for the small file where I kept my will and power of attorney papers. For years, I had left a copy on the top shelf of my closet. The papers you keep because you are practical and because you imagine the future is tidy like a well-folded letter. Max reached for the file before I could move. I snatched it away. It was a small physical thing, cheap folder with stickers from the bank, but inside were documents that had once been offered to me as the neat closure of a life. Signatures, names, a place for someone to act when I could not. I crumpled the folder and tossed it into the trash can like a confession. "You will not sign anything for me here," I told them.
"You will not take decisions from me." They looked affronted, as if my refusal were a breach of etiquette rather than a refusal to be erased. Max said they were trying to look out for me. Lena called a soft friend who seemed to know words to make the room thin. She spoke of concern in bureaucratic tones. I thought about the live stream on the TV, the champagne, the white dress. I thought about the $33,400. When they left that day, they did not slam the door. They walked out with the same polite economy they always used when crossing someone off their list. I stood with my hands on the edge of the sink until the room stilled again. I had never been more awake. Within 24 hours, someone had filed paperwork with the county. A neighbor, Mr. Davis, called me that evening, his voice small with alarm. He had seen the legal forms on the doormat when he came in for his mail. In a small town of apartments and familiarity, paperwork leaves a trail. "They said it was to make sure you were," he began, then stopped. He told me what was on the nearest clerk's notice, a petition for guardianship pending an evaluation. The official words were clinical, incapacity, best interest, but they smelled like something else. They smelled like taking. I felt like someone awake from anesthesia. It is a strange thing to realize your name has been used to make a choice you did not authorize. It turned a private indignity into a public act. I did not yet know how the system worked, how people could, with a signature and a stamp, ask for freedom to be taken away. But I knew my body and my mind and my bills, and the way my hands remembered the rhythm of a sewing machine. I knew I was no one's problem to be solved without my consent. I called Eleanor first. Eleanor has lived 2 floors down for as long as I have been in this building. We met at a church bake sale once, and later found ourselves in the same garden club. Her backyard is a small miracle of potted tomatoes and roses that face the sun like a congregation. She brought lemon cake and a thermos of coffee when she came to sit with me that evening, and she plucked the receipts from the shoebox like someone picking weeds from a garden. "My sister's been through something like this," she said. "You need a lawyer who listens." But she didn't push. Eleanor's help is always practical first. Someone to witness, to write down dates, to go with you to the bank. She asked me questions I didn't know how to answer. Did they say why, she asked. Did they file for emergency guardianship? I told her the truth as I knew it. They had filed something. I had the receipts. They had a live stream on a waiting room TV, and the phrase "only special people" had become a kind of mark. She stood up and put an arm around my shoulder like a younger sister, and for the first time in years, I let the relief of being believed spread through my chest. The first thing Eleanor and I did the next morning was to go to Mr. Klein together. I did not want to face the bank alone. Mr. Klein greeted us in the same small office and seemed to understand more than he would say. He pulled up my account history and set me to work making a list of every payment I had made in the previous 3 years. We walked back through the transfers like stepping stones across a wide river. For each one, I found a screenshot or a bank notification, and we printed it out. Mr. Klein photocopied the withdrawal slips and made a calm pile on his desk. We learned, line by line, that the money had not been a trickle, but a stream. He turned the page on his printout and said, "If you add these up, Miss Renati, you get $33,400. He said it to me like someone naming the weight of a burden and offered me a stack of paper as if that could in itself be redemption. We did not go on television or shout it to a crowd. We made a folder of documentation and we left it on the seat of my kitchen table like armor. The receipts became witnesses. The bank logs became testimony. The live stream was a public artifact, but not, it turned out, the only proof anyone would need. Still, it mattered, because it gave me the courage to stop pretending I was not giving until it had dissolved me. That evening, after a slow dinner that Eleanor insisted on making, I sat and wrote a note. Not a legal thing, just a letter to myself to fix a voice on paper. "I am not for sale," I wrote. "I am not a resource to be drained." The paper felt like something firm under my hand. In the days that followed, things escalated. They are the kinds of escalations that happen not with epiphanies, but with schedules. A lawyer, Mr. Fisher, came to our building one afternoon with the calm of someone delivering a survey. He was the kind of man who carries a briefcase with a brass latch and speaks with slow clarity. He introduced himself as the family's counsel, as someone concerned about my welfare.
He had a card and a smile that knew the edges of influence. I looked at him and felt the sudden ridiculousness of a stranger telling me whom I might trust. "They are worried about you," he said, leaning forward as if in intimacy. "They want an evaluation to make sure you are safe, so we can make arrangements." He spoke about safety as if it were a charity to be dispensed. I thought of the live stream and a white dress, of champagne glasses clinking in a room I'd paid part of the tab for. I thought of the $33,400 and how it had become a bill in the papers of the county clerk. I would later learn that the filing of a petition for guardianship is often the beginning of a legal maze. Papers are served. Evaluations are scheduled. Doctors are asked to weigh in. People you loved recast worry into legal status. For the first time in my life, I tasted the bureaucratic air of being treated like an object rather than a person. Fisher's tone was soft as a measured hand, but I felt like a subject in an experiment he had already designed.
Eleanor insisted I see a lawyer of my own. I could feel the thinness of my armor. I had receipts, but not a strategy. I had neighbor witnesses and not a courtroom plan. Mr. Weber came recommended by a woman at church. His voice was brisk over the phone and steadier than my own. He asked questions with a kind of careful curiosity about my health, my finances, the transfers. He asked me why I had stopped the transfers, and I said simply, I had stopped because I did not like being relegated to a payee. He listened without pity and with a steadiness that felt like a small lighthouse. "You did the right thing to collect what you have," he said, and I felt the strange comfort of being believed in a field where disbelief is common. He advised me not with legal steps, but with a plan I could understand. Gather documentation, get evaluations on my terms, and make sure my voice would be heard. He said the word evidence, and I felt absurdly like a detective in my own life, collecting the strings of what used to be private. Our first move, under his guidance, was to secure the house. We changed the locks. I called Mr. Summer, who owns the hardware store down the block, and he came over with his young employee, Ethan. They were gentle as they worked, and Ethan, friendly and deft-handed, explained the new security camera he could install. I watched as the little box was placed above my front door like a silent witness. The camera would not stop legal filings, but it would make visible what happens in my doorway. It felt good to have something that recorded truth in a way people could trust. Neighbors came and signed statements. Mr. Davis, in his work-worn shirt, swore he had seen Max and Lena at my door at odd times. Mr. Green, the pharmacist, corroborated that Max had often called and asked about my prescriptions, as if he were checking stock for the house. Cynthia, Maria, Carmen, ladies from the garden club, came with stories about how generously I had given, and how quietly, how often, I had hosted soup for a friend after surgery. The stories were small and tender and true. They were the kind of testimony that is not dramatic in itself, but builds a picture of a life that is not incompetent, but generous and lucid. When Mr. Fisher sent his own letter, it was formal and thin. He suggested things as if they were for my protection. He used words like concerned family members and best interest. It felt like watching someone write a script with me in it, and the lines on the page were not mine. I stood at my kitchen table with the shoebox open and the camera above the front door blinking red. The live stream on the hospital TV had been the shock that woke me. The receipts and the neighbors and Mr. Weber were the instruments I would use to write myself back into the story. I did not yet know the shape of the courtroom or the sound of the judge's gavel. I did not yet know which witnesses would bend and which would break. But I knew this. I would not sign anything that made me small. That night I slept badly. I woke up once and looked at the ceiling, at the shadow that the new camera cast. I thought of the white dress, of champagne, of a life I had paid for that turned out to be a life in which I was unpaid in interest. I thought of the phrase, only special people, and I tasted its salt. When I opened the mail 2 days later, a packet had been delivered with a summons. It was plain, official, and it felt like a hand on my shoulder. The county wanted me to come for an evaluation. There was a date stamped and a time printed. The legal machinery had begun to move, and the sound of it, to me, was a grinding I did not intend to step into unarmed. I called Eleanor and then Mr. Weber. I told them the date and the time and felt the small relief of being counted for. Mr. Weber told me to gather everything, my receipts, the bank statements, neighbors' names,
the live stream screenshot, and to prepare to tell the truth. He said plainly, "They will spin concern into control. You make your life visible." That became my mantra, make your life visible. A week later, a friend from my garden club, Cynthia, brought over a binder. She had a neat hand and the type of sympathy that folds into action. Inside were carefully labeled packets, bank statements, copies of texts I had sent Max, printed social media posts, the screenshot from the hospital TV with the live stream showing Max and Lena, and the caption, "We did a thing." Cynthia had even included a map of dates, where money had been sent and when I had been excluded from events. We placed the binder on the chair, and the sun in the window fell across it like a spotlight. It seemed to give the papers a solemnity they had not had in folders and shoeboxes. When a process server left a formal notice on my door, I opened it as if it were mail from a distant country. The Guardian petition listed reasons, adjectives like inconsistent and forgetful, and an allegation that would later be tested by people who learned to read between lines. It suggested interventions. It suggested that someone else should make decisions for me. I read it until the paper blurred, until I knew every legal phrase. I put the packet in the binder. I thought of all the years of being practical and kind, and possibly, unknowingly, buying my own erasure. I thought of the live stream and how quickly a private humiliation had become the axis of a public attempt to take what was legally mine, my home, my account, my decisions. I did not know what would happen in court. I did not know which neighbors would come forward, or how the psychiatric evaluation would be worded. All I knew was that I was awake, and that the ledger of 42 months of giving would be read aloud if necessary. I knew I had Mr. Weber and a binder with receipts, and a camera above my door that kept its small red eye on the world. For now, the trial was a promise in the air, a future page.
People told me to be calm and to breathe, and I practiced when I could. I walked the length of my balcony at night and looked out over the street. The city lights were like small stars made of concrete. I sometimes closed my eyes and pretended I could pack up the apartment, sell the house, leave the building and all the bad memories behind. The idea of selling had been a quiet part of me for years, a thought I cherry-picked when the grief of my husband's absence overwhelmed me. After the hospital live stream and the filing, selling felt less like retreat and more like liberation. Eleanor sat with me as the date for the county evaluation approached. "You have to say what you know," she told me, and she kissed my forehead like a woman teaching a child how to cross a street. The lessons we learn at 71 are often the simplest ones. Keep your papers in order. Trust people who show up. Make friends with your neighbors. When the county nurse came to the apartment for the preliminary visit, she was kind and professional. She asked about my medications and my memory, and the kinds of things you tell to someone who wants to make sure you can feed yourself. I answered plainly. I could have said I was frightened and left it at that, but instead I asked her to note the receipts and the live stream screenshot and the binder and my table. She nodded and wrote. The evaluation, she said, would be scheduled at the center. They would look for signs of cognitive decline, and sometimes, she added in a voice that softened, sometimes families file because they feel overwhelmed. This observation was not an excuse. It was an opening to conversation about how the system often slides from concern to control. When I left for the evaluation the morning of the appointment, I felt as if I were walking into a room where the story of my life would be read by strangers. I put the shoebox in my bag and the binder in my arms. I buttoned my coat. The new locks on my door clicked behind me like a promise I had kept to myself. Outside, the hospital waiting room television was on my mind, its jumpy live feed, its laughing faces. I had decided then that whatever they claimed, I would not be invisible in my own life. If this story is touching something raw inside you, if you have felt the sting of being excluded, of money making the rules of family, share one word in the comments that describes how you felt. It helps to know we are not alone. I walked into the evaluation center with Eleanor beside me and the binder under my arm like armor. The clerk smiled with the faces of people who see too many tragedies at the same lunch hour. A young woman in scrubs led me into a small room with soft chairs and bright light. Behind the glass, a receptionist typed quietly. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new paper. "State your name and date of birth," the evaluator said, voice clinical, and I gave it. He asked a series of questions, days of the week, names of the president, simple things that map memory. I answered. He gave me a small pen and a sheet with shapes to copy. I drew the clock face and filled in the numbers. I felt watched, but not shamed.
He paused at a few points and looked up in a way that suggested he was taking notes. I left that day with instructions for a more formal evaluation. The evaluator had been neutral, almost courteous, and he had not adjudicated anything, yet the presence of that formality felt like a threshold. At the door, someone from the clerk's office handed me a copy of the guardianship petition as filed. It was the paper trail made manifest. When I got home and opened my mail, there was a letter for me from Dr. Moore. He had agreed, at Mr. Weber's prompting, to consult. He wrote that he had reviewed my records and that he would be willing to perform a full assessment to determine my cognitive health. I had seen his name before on a referral list at the clinic. His letter smelled like formality and possibility. It was, for the first time, a professional voice that might anchor me in a court of law. The week became a blur of appointments and signatures and the small practicalities that are the scaffolding of a legal fight. I learned to hold my voice steady. I learned to put the binder on the passenger seat of the car as if I were taking a treasure to a bank. I learned that friends can become advocates and that neighbors who bring cake and who sign statements are a kind of community that holds you upright while the law moves like a ship through fog. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, as I was making coffee and leaning on the counter, the intercom buzzed and the door opened. Max stood there with a man I had not seen before, a lawyer in a gray suit and glasses, his briefcase a black rectangle. He said, "I'm here for the guardianship paperwork," like someone delivering a catalog order. He had the sign-in sheet and a promise embedded in his smile. I did not answer at first. I watched him place the pile of papers on my doormat and turn away, as if it were done. This motion of leaving the problem on my doorstep enraged me in the way of small things. I took a deep breath, this one stolen from the balcony, and went to the door. I picked up the packet and turned it over. The type was small and efficient. It cataloged concern and solution. I looked at Max and Lena. The air between us was a field of consideration and accusations. I felt something like grief pass through me, a small, private grief for the life I had thought we shared. Then I folded the packet neatly and set it on the kitchen table next to the binder with the receipts. It was, I decided, another thing to be processed. Max stood for a moment, and then, with a carefully neutral voice, said, "Maybe we can talk about this where we all feel comfortable." He was offering mediation as if it were a courtesy.
I understood that people sometimes think acting to remove someone's agency is a kindness wrapped in paper. I did not want his kindness. The next days would bring a formal filing with a judge, Judge Miller, I would later learn, dates on a calendar, and the start of a legal narrative that threatened to consume the life I had been building back into being. For now, the packet on my table shimmered with possibility and threat. Outside, the camera above my door blinked its red light, and in the kitchen, the binder sat like an unspoken vow. There were things I had not yet done. I had not yet sold the house. I had not yet placed a call to the elder protection group I had read about online. I had not yet told my sister Diana the whole truth, how much had been taken in the name of love. There were things, too, I had done. Closed accounts, changed locks, installed a camera, called a lawyer. I had, in short, begun to live like someone who decided they were no longer an ATM. The next morning, I woke with the sound of a lawnmower down the street, and my heart full of a fierce, slow resolve. I would gather the witnesses. I would ask Dr. Moore to write down what he found. I would let my community be visible. I would sit in that courtroom under bright lights if that was what it took to keep my choices mine. When I looked at the live stream screenshot again, Max and Lena laughing beneath the banner, "We did a thing," I felt that old warmth of embarrassment, and then a new clarity. I had been invited to nothing. That humiliation had been a blessing in disguise, a wake-up call that showed me what I had been buying and what I had been selling. And so I began to move, with the slow precision of a woman who has loved too long and learned, finally, how to love herself. The fight would not be pretty, it would not be quick, but I would be present for it. I would be visible. I would not be quiet. The camera would watch the door, and the binder would watch the desk. The papers on my table would be the story I told. Outside, the street hummed, and somewhere in a small restaurant, someone was clipping photographs and toasting with thin glasses. Inside, I sat at my table, took a breath, and began to speak the date and the amounts aloud, so that no one could later tell me I had not known what I was doing. $33,400. Each figure was a stepping stone back to myself. I would cross them and I would not fall. The petition for guardianship would arrive at our door in the mail within days. It would mark the beginning of the part of the story where I had to answer to strangers for the life I had lived. But I was no longer the woman who went quietly. I was the woman who had the receipts. I was the woman who had a camera and a binder, and friends who would sit in waiting rooms with me and hold my hand. The next moves would be court dates and formal evaluations and witnesses under oath. They would be long and winding and the kind of cinema that burns slow.
But they had not yet started. And there, in the warmth of my apartment, with the sun on the binder and Eleanor's lemon cake crumbs on my plate, I allowed myself a cup of tea and a wry, small laugh. He had kicked me out of the waiting room, and a live stream had shown me the truth. He had assumed I would fold. He had assumed I would go away. I set the receipts in a neat stack, closed the binder, and put it on the chair by the front door. The camera's red light blinked like a heartbeat. Outside, a car passed and someone shouted to a child. I stood with my hands in my pockets and thought of the white dress in my closet. I thought of all the ways one can be generous and still keep one's dignity. I thought of what it would be like to stand in a courtroom and say, simply, "This is my life." When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I opened it and let 3 women in from the garden club, Cynthia, Maria, Carmen, each with a paper in hand and a story to tell. They came to bear witness. They came to keep me company. We sat at the kitchen table and the house felt fuller, less like a territory to be divided and more like the place I intended to live. The fight was beginning, and for the first time since the waiting room TV had shown them laughing, I did not feel alone. They sat around the kitchen table like a council of saints, Cynthia with her knitting basket, Maria balancing a stack of papers, Carmen folding her hands as if in prayer. Their faces were ordinary and fierce. Each brought a small, steady kindness, a handwritten statement, a memory of a time I'd fixed a casserole for a sick neighbor, a note about a time I'd loaned a book and not complained when it was never returned. They spoke in the soft cadences of women who have lived to be useful and who refuse to let usefulness become exploitation. It felt like a small army forming. The days that followed turned into the long, methodical work of making a life visible. Mr. Weber came over, and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the binder open between us like a map. He went over the receipts, asked about dates, and taught me, gently, how to speak in specifics. He did not give me a formula for victory. He taught me to be a reliable witness. "Speak plainly," he said, and I practiced until the words stopped tasting like shame. We assembled more than papers. We built a narrative. Cynthia organized the bank printouts by month. Mr. Klein agreed to appear and to testify about the pattern of transfers and about my repeated visits. Mr. Green wrote a note about Max calling about prescriptions in a way that suggested he was acting as if he were in charge of my care. Mr. Davis wrote a statement about seeing them at odd hours. Eleanor printed out the live stream screenshot with the caption visible, the public artifact that had started it all. The first court date was a scheduling hearing, the kind of thing that makes you wait for a judge to find time in a crowded docket.
The courthouse smelled like old wood and policy. I arrived early, Eleanor at my elbow, Cynthia beside us both. The building was full of other people's lives in motion. Families, people in suits, a woman with a stroller who kept checking the watch on her wrist. I had never before felt so conspicuous, not because my life had shrunk, but because my life was finally being named. Judge Miller was smaller than I expected, a presence of attentiveness more than theatrics. He asked to hear whether there were any immediate medical emergencies. He read aloud the basic facts in the petition, concerns expressed by family, a request for a guardianship evaluation, a scheduled hearing. He set dates, and in that small, careful way of judicial schedules, the future of my autonomy was assigned a place on a calendar. None of it felt inevitable, but the machine was moving. Depositions came next, my signature on subpoenas, the polite legalese of officials. Testimonies were scheduled and calendars filled in with appointment times. I learned the floor plan of the courthouse, the way the wood railing felt under my hand, the quiet hum of air conditioning that made the room feel simultaneously clinical and sleepy. There are certain preparations that steadied me more than any other. Sitting down in the living room and reading aloud the dates, the sums, the transfers. I practiced telling the story the way Mr. Weber had suggested, without venom, without a plea for sympathy, with the clear-eyed accuracy of someone who has kept books. When I rehearsed, I tried to imagine the eyes of the strangers who would hear me, and to imagine them understanding not just a sequence of transactions, but a life pattern. Dr. Moore's assessment was scheduled midweek. He arrived in his sensible coat with an even hand, and I felt no rush to be other than myself. He asked questions about my childhood, about my habits, about how he paid bills. He watched how I walked across the room, how I opened and closed a jar, how I remembered details. His evaluation was clinical, but not cold. He wrote notes that were later typed into a report that said, plainly and professionally, that I had the capacity to manage my own affairs. That report would carry weight in a courtroom. On the day of the preliminary testimony, I sat in the waiting area, the binder in my lap, the camera above the doorway blinking like a small watchful eye. My hands were steady. My heart was not. People came and went, witnesses, lawyers, jurors,
and each movement felt like a step in a choreography that had finally arrived. Max and Lena arrived together, a unit that looked practiced and thinly frayed at the edges. They both wore the kind of calm people adopt when they expect to be believed. Mr. Fisher, conservative and low-voiced, sat beside them. He moved his papers with a soft precision and glanced at me now and then as if to measure my resolve.
When Lena took the stand, she spoke carefully of concern, of small signs, forgotten appointments, missed calls, the kind of behaviors families sometimes find alarming. Mr. Weber's cross-examination did not assault, it created light. He asked simple questions about dates. Did you attend the event on June 12th? Who else was there? Did Miss Renati contribute to the costs of the venue and the dress? The answers wavered. Small details that had been obvious in private conversation were suddenly inconsistent in public testimony. Lena misremembered dates. Max could not account for certain transfers. Mr. Weber asked about the live stream. Lena's brow tightened. That was just a small celebration, she said. We didn't expect it to be seen. The word only special people hung in the room like an echo. The judge listened with a look that suggested he was weighing more than the words. He was weighing motive. When Mr. Klein took the stand, I felt steadier for his presence. He spoke in the reliable register of someone who describes transactions the way others describe weather. He testified about recurring deposits and about my visits to the branch when I had asked to stop transfers. He said things like, Miss Renati had long-standing orders that were altered in, and through those phrases he provided a map of the financial pattern. He did not moralize. He simply calmly narrated the paper trail. And in the middle of it, Mr. Davis came forward. He described seeing Max and Lena at my door at odd hours, carrying boxes and speaking in low voices. He said he'd noticed a change in the frequency of their visits. Mr. Green recounted that he had received calls from Max about medication, with a tone that suggested decision-making rather than casual inquiry. The Garden Club women told quiet human stories, cakes brought when I had been ill, plants nurtured on my balcony, the way I had once taught Maria how to prune a rosebush. Their testimony painted a life of competence and community, rather than the picture of decline that had been suggested. When Dr. Moore testified, his voice had the steadiness of someone whose words carried professional consequence. He had performed cognitive tests, he had interviewed me, and his written evaluation, read aloud in part by Mr. Weber, said I was capable of making decisions about my finances and my living arrangements. He spoke gently about common family worries, noting that families sometimes act out of fear, and that fear can lead to interventions that are unnecessary. His testimony was not about judgment, it was an appraisal grounded in evidence. The dramatic moment came during cross-examination of Max. Mr. Weber asked him about the origins of the transfers. Max's answers circled between practicalities and entitlement. He had called his mother at times asking for help with rent, with car payments, with bills, he admitted. He had been grateful in private messages that Mr.
Weber later read aloud, messages in which Max thanked me in language that implied assurance and promise. But when Mr. Weber asked whether Max had omitted to recite certain numbers, whether he had accounted for the nearly $34,000 his mother had given him, his voice faltered. I thought we had an understanding, he said finally, and that phrase sounded in the room like an attempt to justify what the receipts rendered undeniable. Fisher, the family's lawyer, attempted to shape a narrative that sounded like care. Ms. Renati occasionally forgot appointments. She had missed some phone calls. Family concern warranted checking. But when witnesses spoke from experience, and Dr. Moore's clinical perspective aligned with my own clarity, the narrative of incapacity lost traction. The judge's questions were precise, about documentation, about motive, about whether the concerns were rooted in evidence or in desire to control. There were small gestures that revealed character. Later, in a break between testimonies, Lena walked past the table where the Garden Club women sat and stopped for a moment. She said something under her breath that might have been an apology. I did not answer. There was nothing to be said in the briefness of a hallway. The trials of adult children and parents are not about single sentences, they are about patterns. That day, the pattern of my giving was read aloud. Dates, numbers, receipts. $33,400. The number had weight in the courtroom because it was not anecdote, it was ledger. Cross-examinations exposed more than memory lapses. Documents were presented. Transfer confirmations, bank statements, canceled transfers, the live stream screenshot. Each page slid across the counsel table like a truth. Mr. Weber showed how the transfers had continued for years, and how attempts to reframe them as casual help belied an accumulation of dependence that favored the adult children's comfort over the parents' autonomy. He did not say, they robbed her.
He showed that choices had been made, and that those choices had consequences. There were moments that stung, comments made by the opposing counsel, little insinuations about the cognitive wilds old age sometimes brings. Those lines felt designed to undermine the witness, to create doubt where none was needed. I stood and answered. I did not cry. I did not shout. I spoke as if reading from a ledger of myself. I said where the money had gone, and why I had given it, and that I had stopped because I realized being helpful had become being invisible. I said what many older people say with small words. I want to make my own mistakes. I want to make my own choices. That seemed to matter. The borough's court calendar is a public thing, and the hearing drew more people than I expected. Friends sat in the gallery like a soft row of supporters. Their faces caught my eye sometimes, and I felt steadier. Eleanor held my hand in the corridor. Mr.
Klein sat in the audience after his testimony, and I nodded at him like you nodded a neighbor who has done you a kindness. After days of testimony, the judge took time to consider. The courthouse felt heavy with the smallness of lives being rearranged. In the interim, things happened that showed me how brittle the world can be and how resilient your preparations make you. There were attempts at reconciliation by Max, messages asking me to consider mediation, offers to pay back, offers that came with strings. There were also strange silences and the occasional rumor passed along by an acquaintance at the market. People looked at me with curiosity and with pity in equal measure. I learned to accept curious glances and to refuse pity. Finally, the day of the ruling arrived. The courtroom was a theater of hushed expectation. Judge Miller read his findings with the deliberate care of someone who knows how legal decisions can cascade into life changes. He acknowledged the family's concern, he acknowledged the petition, and then he went through the evidence. He considered the live stream as a piece of public record, considered the bank statements, listened to Mr. Klein, to Dr. Moore, to the neighbor statements. He weighed the balance between protection and autonomy. The words he used mattered: lack of sufficient evidence and preservation of autonomy. He found that while family concern was understandable, it did not meet the legal threshold for guardianship. He noted the professional evaluation and the documentation of my own financial transactions. He ruled that there would be no guardianship imposed, that decisions about my finances and my home remained mine to make. There was no grand pronouncement of villainy. Rather, it was a sober legal recognition that the state would not take what I had and my agency without clear cause. When his gavel fell, a small, decisive sound, the room exhaled. It was not a theatrical victory, but a quiet vindication. I cried then, not the ragged tears of despair, but a clean, hot cry that felt like the undoing of a knot. People came up to me in the hall with embraces. My friends were there in the doorway, their faces wet with the effort of sitting through a public unburdening. Eleanor's hands were warm on my shoulders. Mr. Weber, ever reserved, allowed himself a small smile. Even Mr. Klein nodded as if he'd always known it would end this way. The aftermath of the ruling was an odd mix of relief and calculation. The legal fight had been won in the sense that a guardianship would not be imposed, but the ruptures remained. Max and Lena did not come over to reconcile. We exchanged a few tense messages, courteous, guarded, and then silence. I had no desire to orchestrate a reconciliation that might cost me more than it would give. The wound had opened and healed in the place where dignity is repaired, not in reconciliation, but in taking back decision-making.
Once the immediate legal question was settled, I moved to take back other parts of my life in tangible ways. I decided to sell the house. The idea of selling had sat with me for years as a possibility. Now it felt like an act of liberation rather than an escape. Eleanor helped me call an agent. The agent walked through my rooms with a practiced eye and suggested small things: fresh paint, a decluttered shelf, staging to show what life could look like in the next chapter. Friends came with boxes and cups of coffee. People who had watched my life unfold in tiny acts of generosity were now helping me pack the things I had once given away. The sale was not a spectacle. It was a slow, practical thing. Showings, paperwork, signatures. When the acceptance came and the moving date was set, I felt the peculiar mixture of grief and elation that marks most endings. There was grief for the apartment with sun in the mornings and the small balcony where I had planted tomatoes. There was elation in knowing I could now imagine traveling without the shadow of an unresolved legal matter, knowing I had the means to rebuild. I kept part of the money for myself. There are things you cannot be practical about, even at 71.
I bought a ticket to a place I had always wanted to see and booked a course at an art studio. Friends laughed at the idea of me in a paint-splattered apron. It sounded foolish and holy to me, both. I arranged donations to an elder protection organization, small and deliberate, in the name of people who needed to know they were not alone. The act of giving back felt like closing a loop. I had given for years in ways that had cost me. Now I gave to a cause that helps prevent others from being taken. The paperwork involved in selling changed my daily rhythm. There were meetings with lawyers, mine again for the transfer, and the ordinary mechanics of life, arranging utility transfers, sorting through decades of accumulated letters. I sold the furniture that Max and Lena had used, furniture that had once been a tableau for their private celebrations. It felt like an unburdening. When the moving men carried the last box out, Eleanor and Cynthia and someone from the garden club came to celebrate with lemon cake and a small bottle of sparkling drink. We sat on the floor amid open rooms and laughed at small things. On a bright morning, suitcase in hand, I flew to a coastal town I had wanted to visit since I was 30 and never had the time. There was a small hotel with a balcony that looked out over the water. I walked on the sand and let the ocean remind me that the world is larger than the small dramas that can dominate a life. I painted, clumsily at first, in a studio that smelled of linseed and turpentine. The instructor was patient and encouraging. I felt myself making marks that were not invoices and that did not count as help to someone else. They were just mine. Traveling did not erase the past, but it softened it.
I sent a letter to my sister Diana, honest and clear, explaining what had happened in as few words as necessary. She wrote back with a mixture of concern and practical advice. Take care of yourself. Call if you need me. Her voice steadied me in the simplest way. There were moments after the trial when the old loneliness returned, not as a wound, but as a companion I could choose. I enrolled in the art class and met a dozen people who became my friends in small, practical ways. We exchanged recipes and ideas for framing a canvas. One of the women, a retired teacher, invited me to give a short talk at the local community center about elder exploitation and the signs to watch for. I said yes. The group listened politely and then asked questions, and I found myself speaking not from shame, but from experience. Keep your receipts. Make your life visible, I said, and the room leaned in. It was strange and empowering to see that my ledger could become a tool for others. Sometimes I think about Max and Lena. I think of the live stream playing on a hospital television and the way something private was made public. That image, humiliating as it was, became a catalyst. I do not wish reheated hostility or public shaming on them. The story is not about revenge. It is about boundaries and the painful lessons that can come when love is exchanged for financial comfort. I do believe that people can change. I do not, however, want to bet my freedom on that uncertain hope. Friends asked whether I regretted giving. It is a complicated question. I do not regret the impulse to help. I regret the lack of boundaries that allowed generosity to become a satellite of someone else's life. The lesson was not that I should have been cold. It was that love needs limits. That learning took time and a great deal of hurting. The donations I made to elder protection organizations were modest but deliberate. I wanted to send a message that experience matters and that others should have resources. I also spent money on myself, a small studio in a shared space where I could teach a workshop, a weekend retreat with women who had stories like mine. I gave talks at community centers about documentation and dignity, always careful to say that everyone's legal circumstances are different, and that what helped me was making my life visible. Receipts, bank statements, witnesses, not because that is legal advice, but because it was my anchor in a legal theater that often privileges documents over testimony. Years after the hearing, I still go to the hospital for checkups. The waiting room television has new content now, health ads, a rotary of announcements. The memory of being asked to leave still stings, but it has been absorbed into a longer narrative. I no longer see the hospital TV as proof of humiliation, but as evidence of a turning point. Sometimes when I pass a room with a television on, I think of Lena's whisper, only special people.
Once, at a summer picnic, someone tried to tell me how to handle an overbearing relation with a flippant comment about tough love. I looked at him and said, "Love is not a ledger, but if you lend your life away, you may discover you gave your seat in it as well." He nodded, as if the sentence landed somewhere helpful. I do not speak often of the judge or of the specifics of the filing.
The point, I think, is not to litigate the past for posterity, but to share what made the difference. Documentation, community, a clear evaluation from a professional who was willing to say what he observed. I will not pretend it was easy. Some nights I wake and think of the shoebox full of receipts and wonder how many others keep such boxes and what patterns they hide. I volunteer at a small helpline now, just a few hours a month, helping to point people toward resources and, when necessary, toward people who can help them make their lives visible. There were soft, beautiful things that came after liberation. I grew a small terrace garden in a rental unit on the 3rd floor of a building with a view of the river. I painted with a woman named Rosa who had been an art teacher for 40 years and who smelled of jasmine and old paper. We became friends over coffee and paint-stained rags. Once, on a clear night, we climbed the steps to the roof and looked at the city spread like a cloth of embers. Rosa lifted a glass and said, "To new chapters." I said, "To remembering to keep our names." The decision to sell and donate had ripple effects. Some friends who had watched the proceedings from afar sent small notes of admiration. Others faded away. Max's name shows up sometimes in my head like a weather report, predictable, changing. He sent a letter years later asking if we could talk. I read it twice and then put it aside. I choose to engage with people who do not make my presence conditional on my purse. That choice is a form of love that is not performative. I am told sometimes that my story resonates because it is at once ordinary and extreme. I like that description. People who watched me get up from a hospital vinyl chair and decide to count what they had given feel something, recognition or fear or hope. They contact me, sometimes with one-word messages, sometimes with long letters. They tell me they saw themselves in my ledger. They ask how I learned to be strict with my own heart. The answer is always a small one. I counted, and I chose. If there is anything I want to leave with you, it is this small practicalness of dignity. Keep records, make friends who will testify to who you are, and do not let fear alone make decisions about your life. I say practical because dignity often needs practical tools, but don't mistake that for coldness. Generosity is a kind of wealth that should be spent, but not in ways that erase you.
On a different balcony nowadays, with a small potted rose that blooms despite my lack of horticultural genius, I look at the stars and say aloud a sentence I say to myself sometimes when the night is heavy. I am free to choose. It is not a revolutionary sentence. It is quietly radical for someone who was once treated like a resource. If you have been touched by this story, if it has opened something inside you, consider doing one of 3 small things. First, share the video with someone who might need to see that a life can be reclaimed. Second, if you are in a position to help, consider supporting an elder protection organization. Give carefully and verify with an established group that helps people like me. And finally, subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories of ordinary courage. We tell them here with care. I will not promise that every struggle ends in the way mine did. The law is uneven. People's lives are complex. But I will say this. Bearing witness to your own life, keeping the receipts, making the documentation, asking your neighbors to stand with you, changes the landscape. It gives shape to memory. It keeps autonomy from being taken in slow increments. When the sun sets now and the city dims to its softer lights, I stand on the small balcony of my rented place and breathe. Once I thought that being generous meant giving until the edges frayed. Now I know generosity is also knowing the perimeter of your heart. I have learned to give with an open hand and to keep the keys to my own door. If someone you know needs help or has a story like mine, leave a comment below or reach out to local elder protection services. If you can, donate to organizations that support autonomy and legal advocacy for seniors. It makes a difference, not as a cure-all, but as a lifeline. I have told you my story because it is mine to tell, and because I hope it helps. I have been humiliated and vindicated, hurt and healed. I have learned that dignity is not a static thing, but a muscle that grows stronger the more you use it. I have seen friendships deepen, and I have found new purposes. I do not know what the future will act like in its small surprises, but I am no longer afraid of them. I have my papers, my camera, my friends, and my name intact. Thank you for listening. If this video helped you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear that reclaiming your life is possible. If you would like a list of resources and organizations that helped me, you can find links in the description below. For now, I will leave you with one small truth I've learned.
Freedom is not the absence of ties, but the presence of chosen ones, and the courage to say no when a love becomes a ledger.